to know more about. We want to separate the myth from the facts. We want to separate fiction from the fact. And we couldn't have had a better person to talk to us about what's happening to COVID, what is the reality, where are we headed. He's done it through his book. So today we'll be discussing his book too. So in the BW Healthcare World Dialogue, let me welcome Dr. Anirban Mahapatra. He's the author of the seminal book on COVID-19, where he's shattering myths. So let's put the cover on the screen before we welcome Dr. Mahapatra for a conversation. Deepak, why don't you showcase the book again? So the book is something that all of separating fact from fiction, COVID-19. So first of all, Dr. Mahapatra, you're a leading epidemiologist, okay? And the last 11 months have been in some way, unimaginable. That's the right word. We keep using the word unprecedented. We keep using the word black swan event. I hope it's not a grey rhino event. But I want to ask you personally and professionally, how have been the last 11 and a half months for you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Batra, for having me on this program. And I'm very indebted to you and to Business World for having me and letting me share my views, not only about the book, but about the last 11 months or so. So in this book, I've distilled a number of various perspectives and gone through over 1,000 research articles. I have to state, I am not an epidemiologist by training. I am a microbiologist. But
sorry, I know in the Business World Review, we did say you're a leading microbiologist. Yes,
thank you
sorry.
so much. I just want to clarify.
When we talk to anyone in the US, the epidemiologists are on top of mind. I don't have to give you the name, but sorry, thank you for correcting me.
Yeah, it's been challenging for everyone. I would say the last 11 and a half months, I just saw a cartoon that was posted today by Dr. Eric Topol, who has been on top of who's the Scripps Institute and has been sharing a lot of information about this pandemic, which I've also found helpful. And the topic of the cartoon, or the gist of the cartoon, was two people were standing in front of a television saying, I don't like season 2 of the pandemic. And this is what it is right now. We are sort of in the season 2 of this pandemic. When it started in March, I know there was a little bit of adrenaline, there was fear, but there was also this sense that it would be over soon, like maybe in 3 or 4 months. Not among the scientists, but among the people generally, there was a sense that if we did something for 3 or 4 months, then the pandemic would end, it would be under control. Now we know that not to be the case. We're sort of struggling against two different opposing forces. One is, on the one hand, the great news is that we have vaccines that work quite effectively and work better than most scientists, including myself, would have originally imagined. And we have to get these vaccines out to people, because vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do. But on the other hand, this countervailing force are this emergence of these variants that have come up since December. And now even in Amaravati and other parts of India, these variants are coming up that are showing that even if you have a threshold of immunity, you can get infected or reinfected. And these variants are much more transmissible. So on a personal level, it's been like everyone else. I've been doing meetings on Zoom for the last year or so. I've been working from home. I've been trying to work out, keep a positive frame of mind. But I also have to marvel at the ingenuity of not just scientists, but the whole world, the corporate sector, the business community, to be able to pivot mainly to a work from home environment and to use these technologies that we have now. I mean, can you think about it? Had this pandemic occurred in the late 90s or in the thousands, we wouldn't be having this type of a conversation right now. So I think there are some positives on that front. The economy in the world took a major hit. But if you look at right now, there is quite a bit of optimism, both in India, UK, United States, that the economy is going to bounce back. So it has been a horrible year or so. But I will also say that I come from a position of privilege of being able to work from home, being relatively safe, and being able to write a book during a pandemic when a lot of people have been struggling just to make ends meet.
Okay, thank you for that perspective. You're right. I mean, you use the right word. I haven't seen that cartoon season 2. I hope there are no more sequels and no more seasons. And I hope the programming is cut short, so to talk in a TV lingo. But let me focus now on your book. What prompted you to write the book? Of course, we can guess what prompted you, but we'd rather hear from you. And why don't you separate the fact from fiction? Give us some content from the book which separates the fact from fiction.
Okay, this is, I hadn't started to think about writing a book in January. I was following this when it was coming out of Wuhan. I don't know if if your listeners will remember this, but in January in the United States, everyone was busy with Donald Trump's impeachment. In India, everyone was focusing on the events that were happening in Delhi. But at that time, there were these reports coming out of Wuhan, China, that they were building these massive hospitals, makeshift hospitals, and they had these live cam views of this disease. And so at that point, I was wondering, well, I was thinking back to the precedents, because we talked about an unprecedented pandemic. The pandemics happen with regularity, maybe not as serious as this one often. I mean, we had 1918. But I was thinking back to previous pandemics and thinking about the various parameters, like how transmissible is it and how deadly is it? And now we obviously know it's quite transmissible. And although the deadliness varies in different populations, it is more deadly than the seasonal flu. So at that point, I was looking at the various pieces of information coming in. And then by March, when it became clear, and some epidemiologists were saying that millions of people would die, at that point, it became clear that we would need some measures. The strange thing about, or I would say one of the ironic things about these pandemics is when a pandemic first arrives, because there are no drugs or vaccines, the technologies are not existent. So the measures that we have to take at that point are measures that are hundreds of years old, like socially distancing, hand washing, keeping our mouths covered. These are not high-tech measures. But even in the midst of that, there is something very, very charming about myths and conspiracy theories that I was noticing. And they were like, I was getting all of these WhatsApp forwards, as I'm sure everyone was as well, about like what's happening with the virus and like it's going to go away in the summer and things like that. And at that point, I thought, well, I was on Twitter and on other social media networks, and I thought I should start to think about this, not just from a perspective of letting people know, but learning myself and documenting this experience, because we have to document what we went through. We have to learn the lessons of the pandemic. And I always believe that it's better to know than to not know. I mean, right now we are all shell-shocked, but we have to learn the lessons from this. And so that was the basic impetus for this. Now, going through this whole process, you asked about like what myths. There are a whole bunch of myths. But a number of myths, I think the most relevant ones right now are tied in with vaccines and how vaccines work. And part of that is the reason that I've thought about this. In our country, there isn't that much vaccine hesitancy with other parts of the world because we are used to, accustomed to dealing with infectious diseases, right? I mean, we always, whenever we drink water, we think like, what's in the water? Whenever we sit down, we think this mosquito is going to bite me. Am I going to get malaria? In the Western countries, they don't think about these things. They've sort of gotten beyond the specter of thinking about infectious diseases on a daily basis. But the flip side is that we don't have adult vaccinations in general. I mean, vaccinations mainly as children, we get them. I still have my vaccination marks from BCG.
We all have done it.
We all have done it.
Children, I've done it for myself.
Right. But we don't get vaccines as adults. So we tend to think of it not as something that's necessary. The only ones that I know of regularly, if somebody's been bitten by a dog or a rabid animal, then they get the rabies vaccine or the tetanus vaccine. Whereas in the West, there is like this trend of getting vaccinated every year with flu shots. So I think in the midst of this, there have been a lot of myths around vaccines, how effective they are, and whether we actually need vaccines. And I've been saying in this book that these vaccines are safe and effective. We should all get vaccinated. And even if you've been infected, it is possible that the vaccine will confer a greater degree of immunity to you than otherwise. So if you get a chance to get a safe and effective vaccine, take the vaccine, get both doses of it. And so this is one of the examples of the myths that I've been trying to dispel.
The myth being that vaccines are not effective.
Not effective or not safe. That was the other one. And I think a lot of people are also worried about safety issues. And I think the analogy I will put here is that of course it has to be safe because vaccines are given to healthy people, whereas drugs are given to sick people. But the analogy I will give here is you never hear about the planes that land on time and land safely. You hear about one or two adverse events like the plane engine that fell out or something like that. But we have to be able to tie adverse events with vaccines. And so far, to my knowledge,
good example, Dr.
Yeah,
Mahapatra.
so far to my knowledge, there have been
that doesn't mean we stop
threats.
flying. That doesn't stop prevented us from flying.
Exactly.
So, what are the other myths that exist, and give us a counter view on those?
Quite a few myths. I would say one of the early myths was, and this was one that was coming up quite rampantly, and that is that that there is no immunity. Like you get infected, you would get infected again, and that is because we didn't know the level of immunity, because the virus, the short answer is the virus had not been around long enough for anyone to test immunity. And there were all these thoughts and reports that came out in the media about antibodies going away, that the antibody titer was being reduced. But the piece of that is that antibodies are also not the only part of immunity. Immunity is like this entire symphony with many, many components and many, many musicians. And in that symphony, the conductor are the T cells. So now what we found is that the antibodies stick around maybe for 6 months or longer in most cases. T cells are also involved in this. So I would say the myth is early on, people thought that immunity would not last in most cases. That is not true. If you've been infected, it is most likely the case that you will have some level of immunity from subsequent infection. Then there are
the only rider being there are new mutants, so that's the only rider.
Yes, absolutely. That is the only rider. That this is the status of what we know. That's what knowledge is, right? So that is what we know right now. The rider is that as new variants come, so immunity. So what happens is as new mutants come, then the immunity starts to blur. It's not an all or none, that all of a sudden you are completely susceptible and you get sick and you die. You will still have some form of immunity, but it won't be as strong. Maybe you will have a milder infection or you will be asymptomatic. But you are absolutely right. The variants put a lot of pages in the playbook out the window.
Okay. Now, if you had to see, you're a scientist. You work with data. You work with trends. You work with science. But if you base it on what you are seeing today and on an expert view, what is that you see happening in the future? I mean, we can't be 100% accurate, but give us some trends that you see happening in terms of the decline of the numbers. Even if you look at New York or USA, the numbers in the last few days have declined. At least there is a ebbing of the curve, right? So give us a sense of where we are headed.
Yeah, I have detailed all the scenarios and how they would play out, how they might play out in my book. As you mentioned in the last question, there are a number of variables. One being the emergence of the mutants and the variants and what they do. The second variable is how fast we can get the vaccines produced and into people's arms. But I wrote in a piece for Mint a few weeks ago that I do see 2021 as a year where we strive towards normalcy, and towards the end of the year, in many parts of the world. Now, not in all parts of the world, because the access to vaccines is not universal. But in many parts of the world, such as the United States and India, we will see a trend towards normalcy. And I do think that Diwali 2021 will be a much better Diwali than Diwali 2020 was. Now, as far as what happens with the virus itself, it's not going to get eradicated. It's not going to go away. I think it is going to remain in circulation as an endemic virus in the population. Something that we had actually also seen after the H1N1 influenza of 1918 and 1919. So the virus is not going away. We will be able to have some immunity to it, either from vaccines or from infection.
Okay. Now let's also talk about the rollout of the vaccine. As you said, just the availability is not good enough. The vaccine jab and the vaccination happening is good enough. In India, the government has done a decent job of 1 crore 20 lakh Indians already last week had got their vaccinations. And in the next 3 months, the government is trying to get to 30 crore Indians in 90 odd days to get to another 28 crore Indians is huge. It's by any standard. The government has been ambitious and is trying its best. Now, when you look at the US, the mortality has been very high, and US has a very advanced healthcare system. I mean, traditionally, if we would speak to anyone, in our mind, in our understanding of scheme, we think US, John Hopkins, and we tend to think of the US healthcare system as the most effective and advanced, if I may use these two terms. What went wrong in the US that so many deaths happened?
This is a great question, and people will be talking about this for years to come. Sitting here in the US and knowing what you said about the healthcare system and about the scientific apparatus here, it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion as it happened from March onward. I think one of the things that we have to say is that there was definitely a number of conflicting messages. There was at the time a lack of leadership. And there were some things that happened very early on that put the US on a very poor trajectory. Like if you remember, the CDC created a test initially, a diagnostic test, that did not work at all, instead of using the test that had been mandated by the World Health Organization. Then after a while, they were pushing drugs like hydroxychloroquine in very large numbers. Then there were a whole segment of the population, even now in this country, that will refuse to wear masks. So there is this alternate reality in which a number of people live, in which the actual threat of the virus was downplayed. They did not take it seriously, and they lost family members. So it was this aspect of seeing that play out in real time that was very, very disheartening. The other second aspect about the United States that is, if you live here, you'll sort of figure out, is that there is a lot of health inequity and disparities. If you have the access to the healthcare that you're talking about, if you have health insurance, you have.
For example,
access.
Just to stop you, I don't intend to.
Yeah, no, please.
But just to support your point, I read a report in one of the leading papers, either New York Times or Washington Post, or one of the editorial platforms, that the deaths for Black were more.
Yes.
The mortality ratio was more. Now, you could always.
It's not just comorbidities.
It's not one reason.
Right. It's not just
comorbidities. Multiple. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but yeah, I'm just giving you a data point.
But it is, and there were a couple of articles in the Lancet which I have quoted in one of the chapters on the impact in my book, and it is, you're absolutely right. It's not you cannot pin it down to just comorbidities. You cannot pin it down to people saying that okay, they were more in the emergency sector and they were essential workers. That's why they were sick. And housing also, how overcrowded housing or anything like that. Overall, early on, it was like underrepresented minorities like Blacks and Hispanics were dying at rates that were 2 to 3 times more than other races like Asians and Caucasians here. So you are absolutely right. Part of that is also access to healthcare, and which they do not have. So there is this definite tiered structure here. Yeah.
There's clearly rather than technology being a, bridger or an equalizer, I think healthcare access is not democratized. There is a lot of inequality. Right. Now, you work in the US, you're from India. What do you think the Indian healthcare policymakers should be doing or policymakers should be doing to buff up the healthcare? I know in the budget there is a bigger
Yeah.
outlay, but beyond that, what do you think needs to be done? Of course, you have talked about the fact in the US, the deaths have been because, the threat of corona was downplayed by the authorities. I read another article, I think in the New Yorker, which called it the patchwork pandemic. Every
Yeah.
state was working on its own, so there was no central direction. And the then president said, "Oh, here it is, go and do it on your own." So there was no like coordination, there was no leadership. We understand that, but beyond that, there were some things happening on the ground which were actually causing all this. So, as you go forward, what are the learnings for the healthcare system in the US? And from where you are, what do you think countries like India can do to build better healthcare access?
That's a great question. That is an absolutely essential question to answer right now while we are in the pandemic. And you are absolutely spot on as well. Even with vaccine distribution, it is handed over to the states. There is no national plan, there is no national emergency program to vaccinate everyone. So each state in the United States is doing this differently.
Just to again, here in India, we appointed a very effective and very renowned bureaucrat in Mr. R.S. Sharma, who was the chairman of the TRAI, to be the head of the vaccine program, and he's a very experienced officer. So clearly, with somebody like him at the helm, you can only hope it would happen. So just wanted to. The Indian government has been able to appoint a very dynamic person, if I may say, as the head of the immunization drive. Go on.
No, I would say for the lessons for India are, if I can point out perhaps two or three. One is I was very, very heartened to see the increase in the budget, recognizing that we will be facing infectious diseases in the future, and not just for testing, but for surveillance. Because this pandemic could have been worse, but we also faced other viruses and infectious diseases. At least 2 or 3 new viruses are emerge in people every year and cause diseases. So this threat is not going away. We're right now thinking about this new strain of avian influenza that has just come up in Russia. And so we have to be careful and always vigilant about these things. The other is obviously antibiotic resistance and multi-drug resistant strains of bacteria, because we use a lot of antibiotics in India. You can just go to the store and buy
it. We pop them up like
exactly. You don't even need a prescription. We just say, okay, I have a fever. 2 days, I'm going to start taking Vimox or whatever, something like that. So that causes a lot of resistance. I think that if we have a little bit more surveillance of these types of strains, then that would be helpful. And then I would say the other point that you mentioned is that in India, between states, there is a lot of disparity between how much is spent in health infrastructure and how the infrastructure is built up. Like if you look at Kerala or Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh, they have very, very good health infrastructure and also qualified and very dedicated and large number of healthcare workers. Now, this is not uniform or parallel in any large country, not in the United States, not in Brazil, not in India. But I think we should also think about places where perhaps like Bihar or Jharkhand, where there needs to be a little bit more, not just surveillance from the rural side, but all the way through the entire state to see that the healthcare infrastructure there is also built up. So I would say these are a couple of the 3 points. One is focus more on surveillance, continue to increase the budget, and make sure that we reduce the disparities between the states in the infrastructure that we have. But the bright lights are already there. As we noticed, India is a powerhouse in manufacturing of drugs and of vaccines. And a large number of the major vaccine makers in the world are based in India. So India is now obviously playing a major role in providing vaccines to many other parts of the world. So that we have a lot of positives as well.
No, and just to add to that, I mean, practically a year back, the PPE manufacturing industry in India was at zero. It
Yeah.
is now an 8,000 crore industry. We import, and the Ministry of Textiles and its enabling policy enabled a lot of private players to be able to build that capacity in a very short span of time. Uh, Reorient textile units to manufacturing PPE kits. So you're absolutely right. And I keep saying, what happened to IT and ITES through Y2K, the Y2K bug?
Yeah.
Corona will do the same to healthcare companies, pharma companies, healthcare businesses, health tech businesses. So pharma, healthcare, health tech, all will kind of see their Y2K moment, so to say.
Right.
My last question, while we can look at the positives, when you sit out, uh, you're an Indian, but you're in the US. What are things that we as citizens in India can do better to be able to prevent ourselves from a gray rhino event? You called it season two, and I hope there's no season three and season four. Like Kerala had done very well, and we were celebrating it, but there is a spike in Kerala in the last 2-3 days. So clearly, we cannot be complacent. There's one thing.
Exactly.
So sanitization has become a habit. Wearing a mask is a habit. Social distancing.
As
we are
much
more
as possible.
cautious. I'll say we're more cautious, but I think we have a good way to go. So tell me, what should we be cautious about? What can we improve as individuals? What we expect too much from the government, which is okay, but what can we do as individuals?
I will build on exactly what you said, and I think complacency is something that we should avoid. I will say we need a little bit of humility. We don't know what's going to happen, and if you look at every one of the countries that dealt with the first wave of the pandemic and were praised, like for example Germany, or even now New Zealand. South Africa went through a wave and saw something very similar where their cases also declined like us. Now they're seeing a second wave. So I would say we're not out of the woods yet. Let's get people vaccinated. Let's continue some of these practices, even beyond the pandemic. I'm going to wear a mask in the future as well. I think it's been normalized now. Hand washing has been normalized.
I think you want to be Jim Carrey. No, you're kidding. Go on.
Yeah. It's a good movie. Yeah. So I think we want to avoid that. And I think we also need to think about all of our citizens as, and by we, I mean, I'm still Indian. But we want to think of all of our citizens as being part of a community. We have a tendency to think of, okay, my family, my region, people who are my linguistic basis, or have my surname, or things like that as my community. But the thing is, like we noticed in various parts of the world, it was first people who were traveling that brought in they were fairly affluent, that brought it in. But then domestic workers, this happened in Brazil as well, domestic workers who lived in favelas, they were spreading it to other places. So we are all in this interconnected maze, and we're all connected together. So we have to think of, when something like this happens again, which it invariably will, we have to think of ourselves as one society and as one community.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, before I bring Urvi to ask the last question, my closing question, who should be reading your book? And which is your favorite chapter in the book?
I would hope that everyone would read it. I tried to make it as simple as possible. There are 22 chapters that are very, very short. So anyone who had any questions about, and they're very, very neatly organized. So about disease, about testing, about the aftermath, about what will happen next. I think you could just pick it up. They wouldn't have to read it. It's not a book that you need to read from page 1 until the end. You can just pick it up and figure out any little piece about it. And I like writing it this way because it allowed me to get up from the daily numbers, right? We're all focused on the daily curves and things like that. It allowed me to take a bigger perspective. And my favorite chapter is the chapter on emergence, like how, because it has a little bit of a sort of a thriller perspective as to, and it puts into perspective how, what we know, how this virus emerged, how viral threats emerge overall, and why they're not uncommon. So I like that chapter because it had a little bit of sort of a historical perspective, but also a broader perspective of how this virus stands compared to others.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Dr. Mahapatra, for writing this. I'm sure it'll help people in having a better understanding and being better prepared and having the right perspective when you approach COVID. So, Urvi, would you like to ask a question to Dr. Anirban Mahapatra?
Good evening, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Sir, what would you say is the amount of caution when we look at the previous pandemics as compared to this one? Where do you think we stand as a society with respect to the caution in traveling and working?
This has been sort of a moving target. I know early on, if you recall, and I wrote about this as well, early on there was about a year ago, there was quite a bit of fear as to people who were washing vegetables with like soap water, which is absolute. This is another myth. You should never be doing that because you can have soap residues that you ingest. And people were very much worried about surfaces and boxes and objects and things like that. Now we know that that's not a major way of how this virus is spread. So that is one aspect of it. But I think as this pandemic stands, there's the global perspective and then there's the India perspective. The global perspective is, yes, Dr. Batra mentioned the Black Swan event. I wouldn't say it's so much as a Black Swan event, but it is definitely the unprecedented in our lifetimes. And we've never seen anything like this. I would say so far, I mentioned humility, but I would say so far, India has fared better in this pandemic than we did in 1918. I mean, all the precedents come up against that last big one in 1918, where anywhere maybe 13, 14 million people died. And compared to that, we are faring much, much better. Now, nobody really knows this. You hear a lot of theories about this. That's like the topic du jour right now. Everyone is talking about like why fewer people in India died. There could be a number of reasons, but overall, I think this pandemic has been less severe in terms of mortality than the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919. And that's good. I think we can all be thankful for that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahapatra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We
again.
look forward to another conversation with you soon again. And I'm sure those who have missed it can review read the review of the book in the BW Business World issue, or read the full text of the interview on the Business World site, or watch it again on the Business World YouTube channel. Thank you, Dr. Mahapatra, for talking to BW Business World. And we wish you luck. And I hope we do a season 3, which is about the death of COVID.
I would like nothing better. Thank you so much, Dr. Batra.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.